I have my story to tell about the contemporary classic, The Origins of the Christian Mystical Tradition, that has been mentioned on several occasions already. I loaned it to a wonderful friend a couple of months ago, and asked for the book back just this last Sunday, and my friend told me sincerely, I really didn't want to return it to you. And I said, why? Well, because I love the book so much, I'd rather really keep it. And I foolishly said, of course, keep it. I mean, that's the whole joy of giving an individual actually a book that he would like. Because I relied on the fact that our library had 3 copies of the book, and I thought I would get the latest edition. Well, I was foolish in that assumption, because while our library indeed had those 3 copies, all 3 copies, 40 years after the publication, were actually checked out. So I had to get my copy actually from a neighbor university, and so which happily arrived in my mailbox the next day. We have drones that do this sort of thing nowadays. No, we don't. And so I think we talked a lot about humility in this conference, but if you actually want to see humility in action, read Father Andrew's Retractiones, or an afterword, in the new edition of The Origins of the Christian Mystical Tradition. And I think you will be, I think yourself also, profoundly humbled by a kind of a wonderful display of scholarly humility and an attempt at going back essentially to what he has said before, to perhaps clarify and speak about the topic with a kind of renewed sense of clarity. Since Plato, Greek philosophers and Christian theologians have had recourse to the taxonomy of the active and contemplative lives in order to provide an account of the good life, happiness, and perfection. Now, focusing on the texts that treat action and contemplation as correlative terms, the paper investigates 3 main questions. First, what is the content of the 2 lives in a given historical source? Second, how are the 2 lives related to each other? Which life is superior? Third, should the 2 types of life be combined or mixed? And if so, how and for what reasons? My sources will include Plato, Aristotle, PHILO, Clement, Evagrius, and Maximus. And we could certainly discuss Oprah during Q&A. In English, the terminological distinction between active and contemplative lives goes back to the Latin equivalents vita activa and vita contemplativa, and the underlying Greek pair of the praktikos and theoretikos bios, from which we also derive our adjectives practical and theoretical. As I will show, the content of both lives will undergo important paradigm shifts throughout history. So let me begin with Plato. For Plato, the active life is exemplified by involvement in politics and military service. In contrast to the active life, the contemplative life involves a withdrawal from politics in order to, and I quote, graze freely in the pastures of philosophy and do nothing else, unquote, as he puts the matter in the 6th book of the Republic. The philosophical way of life is different from the art of the sophists who misuse philosophical arguments for political and financial gain. The main motive for the philosophical withdrawal is that in politics, the pursuit of justice and truth is impossible without corruption and falsehood. And our present historical moment provides ample examples for this observation. We can lament with our British colleagues the recent elections. The true philosopher, in contrast, conforms his life to the transcendent forms of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and in the process acquires a likeness to God. Now, whereas in Republic 6, Plato advocates the philosophical withdrawal as the happiest mode of life, the overall thrust of Book 7 suggests that this withdrawal is not the full story. In the famous allegory of the cave, the philosophical seer initially gets out of the cave in order to apprehend the true beauty. However, having caught a glimpse of the forms, which Plato compares to a vision, theoria, of the sun and its light, the sage returns into the cave in order to share his knowledge. This return requires some adjustment of one's sight to the darkness of the cave. Plato warns that the philosopher's attempt to lead his fellow citizens out of the cave is likely to result in a tragedy. The cave dwellers may react violently towards the lover of wisdom, and Plato could never forget that the Athenians condemned his teacher to death. The death of Socrates was a factor, I believe, in Plato's decision to withdraw from politics and turn to the life of study and teaching. Plato realized that his recommendation of a philosophical withdrawal instead of a political career was bound to meet skepticism and resistance. Still, Plato insists on the importance of such a withdrawal, as well as on the fact that the governing hand of a philosopher king, whose mind conforms to the true, the good, and the beautiful, is necessary for the harmony and the happiness of the state. The true philosopher will engage in politics out of duty to the state, not because he believes that such a life is preferable to the philosophical withdrawal. While the paradigms of active and contemplative life will change, this pattern of relationship between the two lives will feature prominently in later thinkers, including Aristotle. Aristotle discusses the relationship between the active and contemplative lives in two treatises, the Eudemian Ethics and the Nicomachean Ethics. It's generally held that he produced the Eudemian Ethics before the Nicomachean Ethics, although the minority of scholars holds that this chronology must be reversed. Like Plato, Aristotle takes the active life to be paradigmatically represented by political activity. In contrast, contemplation is a life dedicated to philosophical inquiry. In the Eudemian Ethics, Aristotle defines happiness as, I quote, activity in accordance with complete virtue, unquote. The Greek term arete, virtue, includes both moral and intellectual excellence. Complete virtue implies a combination of different types of excellence. Since on this definition, the best life includes both moral and intellectual activity, then the best life must be mixed, involving both political action and philosophical reflection. So in his account of the mixed life, Aristotle treats philosophical reflection as superior to any other form of activity. Now, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle reasons that, and I quote, happiness is activity in accordance with the highest virtue, and this will be the virtue of the best element. Whether this best element is intellect or something else, we think naturally rules and guides us, and has insight into the matters noble and divine, or whether it is divine or just the most divine element within us, its activity in accordance with its own proper virtue will be complete happiness. End of quotation. Aristotle subsequently argues that the intellect is indeed the highest element, since this element differentiates humans from animals and makes us most godlike. The activity of contemplation, understood as a philosophical inquiry, is the most godlike because it is the least dependent on external circumstances, hence the most self-sufficient. Contemplation is also self-sufficient in the sense that one engages in the philosophical inquiry for its own sake, not for the sake of an end outside of such an activity. As paradigmatic communities engaged in such an inquiry, Aristotle seems to have had in mind Plato's Academy and his own Lyceum in Athens. In contrast, the practical virtues are engaged for some other end rather than for their own sake. So, for example, one exercises courage in war for the sake of the restoration of peace. Similar to the Eudemian Ethics, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle extols the value of philosophical inquiry, but then goes on to argue that the contemplative life alone, not the mixed life, is conducive to complete happiness. So in both treatises, Aristotle maintains the superiority of the contemplative life over the active life and recommends a voluntary philosophical withdrawal at the end of a successful political or military career, which he himself undertook. Even if the philosopher's authentic happiness may not require his continued involvement in the active life, and as we have seen, Plato is relatively clear about this matter, whereas Aristotle is somewhat ambivalent, the governance of the state can benefit from and sometimes depends upon people who have withdrawn from the political life in order to dedicate themselves to the life of the mind. This fine paradox was important for Cicero, as well as to the Jewish philosopher PHILO of Alexandria and the Christian authors who followed him. I'm actually skipping Cicero so that I could get to PHILO. PHILO of Alexandria is a bridging figure who synthesized the insights of ancient Greek and Hellenistic philosophy with scriptural reasoning. For PHILO, as for his philosophical predecessors, the active life finds its highest fulfillment in the political sphere. PHILO agrees with the view that only a crisis in the affairs of the state may justify the true philosopher's interruption of the contemplative life and a return to politics. And here his examples include Brexit negotiations as well as drafting the articles of impeachment. I cite the historical examples that PHILO mentions. Just wanted to be sure that you were still following. With much rhetorical flourish, PHILO bewailed the fact that the engagement in politics has robbed him of badly needed tranquility. Significantly, the Jewish theologian shifts the meaning of the contemplative life to embrace the study of scripture, communal worship, and prayer. PHILO interprets the 6 days of creation as an allegory of the active life and takes the Sabbath rest to be an allegory of the life of contemplation. Patristic authors, including Maximus, will further develop this particular allegorical connection. PHILO also presents the Old Testament patriarchs and Moses as exemplary contemplatives. The apex of the contemplative life is the vision of God, theopsis. By drawing theoria into the orbit of Jewish religious practices and by connecting the exemplars of contemplation with the biblical figures, PHILO initiated a paradigm shift that has had an enduring impact upon subsequent Christian adoption of the ideals of the active and contemplative life. In the beginning chapter of the treatise known under its Latin title, De Vita Contemplativa, and that is the title stemming actually from Eusebius's church history, PHILO introduces two Jewish groups, the Essenes, who pursue the active life, and the Therapeutae, who pursue the contemplative life. The Essenes are commonly identified with the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. The identity of the mysterious Therapeutae, their historicity, as well as their relation to the Essenes, is a moot point. For the purpose of this particular paper, I will bracket the matter of historicity, which we could certainly discuss during the Q&A, and treat the Essenes and Therapeutae as exemplifying the active and contemplative lives as PHILO understood them. Now, PHILO's discussion of the Essenes survives in a fragment preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea. According to the fragment, the members of the group are adult males who live in close-knit communities which hold all property in common. They engage in agricultural farming, cattle breeding, beekeeping, and different arts and crafts in order to meet their basic needs. They share table fellowship together, provide communal care for the sick and the elderly, and remain unmarried. PHILO adds that the Essenes, quote, admire virtue and love gentleness and humanity, but does not elaborate on their religious practices. According to PHILO, the Therapeutae are a Jewish group whose settlements are found in Greece and Egypt, outside the cities, because they seek philosophical withdrawal and solitude. They pursue solitary life away from the crowds, living very modestly. So I will not be reading this quote in the interests of time, but I would let you process the quote. It is a significant quote in which, for example, the term monasterion or monastery shows up for the first time, or actually, maybe it's in the next quote. No, it is in this quote, second line. PHILO also relates that the Therapeutae are, quote, accustomed to pray twice every day, in the morning and in the evening, adding that, I quote, the interval between, and this is the next quote, the interval between morning and evening is by them devoted wholly to meditation on and to practice of virtue, for they take up the sacred scriptures and philosophize concerning them. End of quotation. Each member of the group spends 6 days in solitude, coming together on the 7th day in order to hear an exhortation of one of their elders, share a common meal, and participate in all-night vigils, which include singing and even dancing. At the rising of the sun, they retire each to his or her own house in order to continue their contemplative life in solitude. This semi-secluded life of Philo's Therapeutae would become a blueprint for later Christian skete, a type of monasticism that is a middle way between the eremitical or purely solitary type on the one hand and the cenobitic or communal type of monasticism on the other hand. For Philo, there was a deep continuity between the philosophical withdrawal advocated by Plato and Aristotle and the life of the Therapeutae. However, I wish to highlight an important shift. Philo's version of the contemplative life is no longer primarily about speculative philosophical inquiry. Rather, this life is about regular prayer, recitation of the Psalms, composition of hymns, as well as the reading and interpretation of Scripture. Philo himself identified these activities with true philosophy, but it's clear that the object of this activity is to superimpose the exegesis of Scripture upon the contemplation of nature. While Philo doesn't make it explicit, the logic of his presentation suggests that the contemplative life of the Therapeutae is superior to the active life of the Essenes. So we move to Clement of Alexandria. Clement was familiar with the distinction between the active and contemplative lives, which had become a common trope in the Greek paideia. Clement was profoundly influenced by late antique Stoicism, Platonism, and Philo. The primary thrust of Clement's teaching is to understand Christian life as a growth, from faith through the cultivation of virtues to true knowledge, or gnosis. While consistently emphasizing growth, Clement is more exploratory in his differentiation between the practical and contemplative aspects of Christian life. In some cases, Clement appears to favor the Stoic conviction that contemplation is also a form of activity, and that therefore contemplation and action remain inseparable even in the best of lives. In other cases, he seems to align himself closer to the Platonist view that the contemplative dimension should ideally dominate, although it might be impossible to abandon the active life altogether. Clement's Protreptikos is intended as an exhortation for educated pagans. His Pedagogos is a treatise on the Christian life addressed to the new converts to Christianity, and his Stromatis treat the lifestyle of a Christian Gnostikos, among many other topics. The Pedagogos is primarily concerned with the practical matters pertaining to Christian faith and mores. So Clement states his goal in the Pedagogos as follows. He says, quote, the instructor being practical, and the Greek here is hodidaskalikos praktikos deon. His aim is thus to improve the soul, not to teach, and to train it up to a virtuous life, unquote. So the Stromata, while continuing to be concerned with an account of moral perfection, moves beyond purely practical matters into the more theoretical realm of Christian teaching and contemplation. The Christian Gnostic is a person who has already undergone an appropriate training in virtue, practices self-control, and is on the path to apatheia, which could be rendered as dispassion, impassibility, or freedom from passions. Clement is the first patristic author to Christianize the Stoic moral ideal by associating it with the fear of God, the interiorization of the commandments, and the love of Christ. Clement's Gnostikos continues to practice ascesis. He can marry or choose to remain single in order to be free from the cares and temptation associated with family life. He lives a life of simplicity and shows compassion to those in need. While the beginners in faith need to master their passions and in this sense are involved in action, the Gnostic's life remains mixed. As Clement puts it, the purpose of such a life is twofold, and I quote, partly knowledge-based contemplation and partly action. Clement describes the contemplative aspect of Gnostic's existence thus, and I quote, "His whole life is prayer and converse with God," unquote. So the emphasis, do I have that quote? Probably not. The emphasis on prayer echoes PHILO and anticipates Origen and other ascetical writers, including Evagrius. Now I have to skip Origen, and again, Origen obviously would have to be left for potential Q&A. Evagrius of Pontus stands in the tradition of Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and the Cappadocian Fathers. Evagrius follows the Origenist tradition of Christianization of Stoic taxonomy of the practical, natural, and theological aspects of the Christian doctrine. Building on earlier Christian reflection, Evagrius speaks of a twofold way of prayer involving the practical, praktiki, and the contemplative aspects. Evagrius follows Clement's terminological choice in speaking of the practitioner of prayer as Gnostikos. And here I think I would submit then when we translate his praktikos as simply praktikos and then his Gnostikos the same manner by transliteration, I think we miss the potential reference to active and contemplative lives. In other words, we miss the tie with a larger tradition of reflection on the subject. So the Gnostic mode of life is about the contemplative knowledge of God's presence in nature, physiki, and the direct apprehension of God, theologia. As Andrew Louth explains in the origins of the Christian mystical tradition, and I quote, "Theologia is the realm of prayer. For Evagrius, prayer is not so much an activity as a state, katastasis, not so much something that you do as something that you are." He says of the mind that it is its very nature to pray. In prayer, the soul regains its primordial state as nous, so apatheia is the prerequisite for prayer, understood this way. So while there are important points of contact with PHILO and Clement and the Origenist tradition, Evagrius breaks with this tradition by locating both practical, that is active, and Gnostic or contemplative lives within the context of monastic withdrawal from the world. As he puts it, the praktikos is the servant of separation and the Gnostikos the assistant of wisdom, unquote. Only those who have undertaken what Evagrius calls the first renunciation, by withdrawing from the world and renouncing external things, may subsequently pursue the practical life. The second, internal renunciation of vices and passions, occurs within the context of the practical life. For this reason, some translators, including Andrew Louth, render praktiki as ascetic struggle in Evagrius and his follower Maximus the Confessor. The third and final renunciation, that of ignorance, occurs within the context of the Gnostic or contemplative life. And here is a quote from Praktikos. "The person making progress in the practical life diminishes the passions. The one progressing in contemplation diminishes ignorance. For the passions, there will one day be complete destruction, but in the case of ignorance, they say one form will have an end, the other will not," unquote. Now, Evagrius' somewhat cryptic point seems to be that whereas the first form of knowledge, the knowledge of God through nature, can be exhausted, the second form of knowledge, the knowledge of God that is more direct, is inexhaustible. Unlike some later monastic teachers, Evagrius doesn't envision the active and contemplative lives as two different vocations, which will later correspond to different monastic orders in the West. On the contrary, he insists that the two modes of life are mutually reinforcing. Says Evagrius, "Praiseworthy is the person who has yoked the Gnostic life to the practical life, so that from both springs he might water unto virtue the land of the soul. For the Gnostic life gives wings to the intellectual substance by the contemplation of the superior goods, and the practical life, quote, puts to death the members that are upon earth, fornication, impurity, passion, vice, evil desire." That's a quote from Colossians 3:5. "Therefore, those who through these two have put on the protection of full armor of Christ will then easily overcome the wickedness of the demons." End of quotation. So the demons oppose not only the moral struggle, but also the ascetic's search for knowledge. Since the struggle with the passions is likely to be lifelong, the search for the knowledge of God must be grounded in the practical life. And so, as Evagrius teaches, Let the power of your words be constituted by your works, for acts to be done are dearer to wisdom than words to be said, as they also involve greater ascetic effort. Just as when the practical life is present, words are dazzling bright. So when works are absent, words do not flash forth with the power of works. End of quotation. As we see, Evagrius monasticizes both lives, assumes that apatheia in the practical life is secured for the sake of love and theoria in the Gnostic life, and insists that both lives remain intertwined through the monk's earthly life. And so finally I turn to Maximus. Maximus follows the Evagrian paradigms of the active and contemplative lives, associating praktiki with the ascetic struggle crowned by love, and theoria with the apprehension of divine presence through nature and directly in the mystical union, or theologia. Maximus's thinking about the spiritual progress is not linear, but spirals back to the foundational significance of praktiki. Here is a pivotal quote. He who embodies spiritual knowledge in his practice of virtues and animates this practice with spiritual knowledge has found the perfect method for accomplishing the divine work. He in whom spiritual knowledge and ascetic practice are not united either makes the first, that is spiritual knowledge, an unsubstantial illusion, or turns the second into a lifeless idol. For spiritual knowledge, not put into practice, doesn't differ in any way from illusion, lacking such practice to give it real substance. And practice uninformed by intelligence is like an idol, since it has no knowledge to animate it. And so while agreeing with Evagrius on the foundational significance of the practical life, of the ascetic struggle for the contemplative life, Maximus gives both a distinctly Christological inflection that is lacking in Evagrius. And so I quote from Maximus. In the man engaged in the practical life, the logos, being thickened by the ways of life and of the virtues, becomes flesh. Whereas in the man engaged in the contemplative life, growing lean by spiritual thoughts, he becomes what he was in the beginning, God the Word. And so, end of quotation. The movement here is from the participation of the praktikos in the Logos incarnate to the participation of the theoretikos in the Logos prior to the incarnation. How much time do I have?
A couple of minutes.
So I would skip a small section. And so to conclude, let me briefly summarize my findings. First, the taxonomy of the praktikos theoretikos bios was of considerable importance to the ancient Greek philosophers, PHILO, and numerous Christian theologians of late antiquity. The paradigms of these two lives shifted. For the ancient Greek philosophers, as well as PHILO, the main paradigm of active life is a political career. Clement of Alexandria, building on Aristotle and the Stoics, associates the practical life with the exercise of moral virtue, irrespectively of a particular occupation. Evagrius locates both active and contemplative modes of life within the framework of the monastic renunciation of the world. As for the contemplative life, Plato and Aristotle associated it with a withdrawal from politics for the sake of philosophical reflection. Philo transforms philosophical withdrawal into the life of his mysterious therapeutae, who are dedicated to ascetical practice, fasting, prayer, as well as reading and meditation on the Hebrew Scriptures. Christian ascetical writers often started from the Philonic core of the contemplative life without altering its substance. Within the contemplative life of his Christian Gnostic, Evagrius distinguishes, following the Stoics, the contemplation of divine presence in nature and the direct apprehension of God. Maximus, as we have just seen, envisions the practical and contemplative lives as progressive participation in the incarnation of the Logos and deification. So most authors view the contemplative life as superior to the active life. As I have shown, Clement, Evagrius, and Maximus teach that the ideal life is mixed, rather than purely contemplative, and that the contemplative life, no matter how advanced, must always include a practical dimension. And so let me simply finish by mentioning the fact that the discussion of how the contemplative ideal was challenged at the Reformation, as well as the rediscovery of the value of contemplative contemplation in contemporary pop psychology, would have to wait for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Yeah.